When people think of the calendar in America, we think of a particular day, month, and year. But the inclusion of a year is a modern practice. It was not used in ancient times. Many cultures indicated the year by who the ruler was at that time. So you might say, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, to indicate what year it was. If people remembered the reign of Tiberius Caesar, they could then count 15 years into his reign and know which year you're referring to. Otherwise, people were primarily concerned with the days of the week, the month, or the seasons. Without clocks and calendars, people tried to keep time based on the motion of the sun to know what the hour of the day was, or the phases of the moon to know which week it was. The reason why there are 4 weeks in a lunar month is because there are 4 phases of the moon. The new moon, when the moon is completely dark, the first quarter waxing, which means the lightened portion is growing day after day, the full moon, when the moon is fully lit, and the last quarter waning, in which the lit portion shrinks until it reaches the new moon status again. So people could easily tell what day of the week or month by simply looking at the moon for reference. It was much harder to determine when a new year had passed. We use a Roman calendar in America, but other countries use different calendars. Most calendars are rooted in religion. For example, there is a Hindu calendar, as well as a Jewish, Buddhist, and Islamic calendar. America uses a combination of Roman and Christian elements. Notice that the days of the week are named after Norse gods, and the months are named after Greek and Roman gods. And the year is based on, allegedly, the birth of Jesus. Some people wrongly believe that the year is based on Jesus' death because the AD abbreviation accompanies the date. But the AD abbreviation does not stand for after death. AD is an abbreviation of the Latin phrase Anno Domini, which translates as in the year of the Lord, as a reference to Jesus, who Christians regard as their Lord and Savior. The problem with that phrase is that it carries the presupposition that people using it think of Jesus as Lord, but not everyone does. So secular institutions have replaced this abbreviation with the neutral phrase CE so that religious beliefs would not be imposed on others, and non-Christians who use those dates would not be required to refer to Jesus as their Lord. The abbreviation CE could mean Common Era, Christian Era, or even Christ Era, depending on one's religious beliefs. The BC moniker refers to the time before Christ. That is why AD cannot mean after death. If BC means before Christ and AD means after death, then we're missing about 33 years of history in our calendar. It also raises some pretty weird questions, such as, when was Jesus born? 33 BC? 33 years before Christ? And when was Jesus baptized? 3 years before Christ? Of course, none of this makes sense. Jesus died sometime around 30 AD. So if AD stood for after death, that would make this year 1990 something. I've even heard that some school teachers teach that AD stands for after death, but they should know better. We don't know exactly the date of Jesus' death, in part because the Christian calendar was not invented until 500 years later, when a group of Christian bishops decided to count backwards to his birth in order to figure out how many years were in their liturgical cycle. The number they came up with was 532, so that began the Christian year within the Christian religion, and it was used exclusively in the church to keep track of the liturgical cycle. It took another 1,000 years before the year was used in political documents, such as the U.S. Constitution. Other countries started using this dating method in the centuries that followed. We now suspect that the year of Jesus' birth was closer to 4 BCE based on 2 passages from the New Testament. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 3, verse 1, it states that Jesus was baptized in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, and later says that he was 30 years old at that time. So, if you were to count backward 30 years from the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius, you would place his birth around 2 BCE. However, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, verse 1 states that Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great. Most historians date Herod's death at 4 BCE. so it's not clear which date is correct. Others have tried to date his birth around astronomical events in 7 or 2 BCE in order to account for the reference to a star mentioned in Matthew, but both of those events pertain to the planets Jupiter, Mars, or Saturn, not stars. The point is, we just don't know for sure what year it was. Each calendar based its calendar on some highly significant event that starts the calendar ticking, although it's not always clear what that event may be. Many Hindus trace their calendar back to either a great war in India called the Mahabharata War, or possibly the birth of Krishna, the incarnation of Vishnu. The largest sect of Jainism bases their calendar on the death of Mahavira, their founder, just like Buddhists do with the death of the Buddha. Zoroastrians base their calendar on the birth of Zarathustra, as do the Sikhs with the birth of their founder, Guru Nanak. Muslims base their calendar on the escape from Mecca after the attempted assassination of the Prophet Muhammad. Thus, the current year in each religion reflects how long it has been since their significant event occurred. So these are the current years in the calendar systems in the year 2020 AD. Some religions use a solar calendar to mark their years, while others use a lunar calendar. A solar calendar tracks the movements of the Earth around the Sun, which we now know takes about 365.24 days. But lunar calendars track only the amount of light displayed on the moon. Since a lunar month is approximately 29.5 days long, a lunar year is only 354 days. 29.5 times 12 is 354. So lunar years go by quicker than solar years, assuming that they're using a 12-month pattern. That means that the months change seasons year after year, precisely 11.24 days earlier each year. That can be a disadvantage if you want holidays to fall on a certain day of the year, like Christmas or 4th of July. The advantage to a lunar calendar is that it is very easy to keep track of the moon. Solar calendars have to keep track of the sun, but their months don't line up with any astronomical events. So you see, it's a trade-off. Jews understood this predicament and created what's called a solar lunar calendar instead. They follow the lunar months to a T, and then they add a 13th month every 2 or 3 years in order to keep up with the sun. Jews have the best of both systems since they can easily monitor the length of each month and still maintain similar seasons for each month. Holidays still don't land on the same day each year, consider Passover or Easter. But no one would really care about that in ancient times. Our modern clocks make it possible to keep precise times year after year. Calendars emerged out of the practice of telling time in antiquity. Before there were clocks and calendars, humans kept track of the passage of time by following the motions of the sun and the moon and the changes of season. Days were easy to count with the setting or rising of the sun. Jews and Muslims start the beginning of the day with the sunset in order to clearly identify holidays like Sabbath or Ramadan. Jews also base this practice on the book of Genesis, where it says, God created the heavens and the earth, then it was night, then it was day, the first day. So they start counting their day when nighttime begins, at sunset. Other civilizations like the Romans start their day at midnight in order to preserve a more accurate 24-hour time period. Whereas sunrise and sunset change every day, 3 minutes earlier in the spring, 3 minutes later in the fall, midnight stays the same throughout the year. Of course, before there were clocks, it was impossible to tell exactly when midnight occurred. Noontime was more evident because people could observe when the sun reached its zenith in the sky. So they figured out the equal length of time from noon to the middle of night and then back again. That way, days would always be of equal length, but this calculation of the half day marked the transition from natural phenomenon to human contrived record keeping of time. Instead of looking at the sun or moon to tell the time and date, people started following precise measurements of the 24-hour period, regardless of what the sun or moon were doing. Thus, the Roman calendar changed everything. Now, our months don't line up with the moon. Our days don't line up with the sun, even at noon, and the years have to be modified every 4 years to account for leap years. The same transition occurred with months. The word month refers to the moon as it changes from a new moon to a full moon and then back again. Without a calendar, it would be difficult to keep track of how many days had passed over a long period of time, but the moon provided an easy way to measure it. Native Americans often referred to the number of moon cycles when calculating herd migrations or voyages. So began the month, or moon. New moons and full moons were relatively easily identified with a clear sky. However, months do not line up evenly with a precise number of days. A lunar month is 29 days, 12 hours, 44 minutes, and 33 seconds. So the length of a month could oscillate between 29 and 30 days each month. Furthermore, it's not evenly divisible by 2 or 4. This is probably where we get the 7-day week. It would take about 7 days for the new moon to change to a half moon, and then another 7 days to become a full moon. About 2 more weeks later, it would return to a new moon. Thus, the week became a standard measurement, approximately 7 days. The same emerges with the lunar calendar. There are 365.24 days in a solar year. Plus, it was very difficult to determine when a solar year began, since there was no distinct moment during the year that is obviously the same each year. There are 4 events each year that might serve as astronomical markers: the 2 solstices and the 2 equinoxes. Unfortunately, it's difficult to know when the longest and shortest day of the year is without the use of precision clocks, because days before and after the solstices had about the same amount of daylight as the solstice itself, so people had to guess which day it actually fell on. The equinox are not much better, but they have the advantage that sunset and sunrise are about 3 minutes different from the days immediately before and after. Of course, people in ancient times did not know what a minute was because they didn't have mechanical clocks. The best they could do is measure the length of the day of the equal length of night and day to see if they were even. It was for this reason that most cultures of the world began their calendar year at the spring equinox. The spring equinox could also coincide with the coming of plant life, which would mark the time when farming practices could resume. As you will see in this class, most cultures celebrate their New Year's on or around March 21st. Exceptions to this New Year's timeline include the Romans, the Jews, and Hindus. Jews started their New Year celebration after the harvest was brought in. This would indicate the end of the agricultural year. It also aligned with their views of Genesis 1. If the new day begins at sunset, then the new year should begin at the sunset of the seasons. You could compare winter to nighttime, spring to sunrise. Thus, summer becomes noontime, and fall would resemble the sunset. The Roman calendar originally celebrated New Year's Day on March 21st with everyone else, until they moved their Senate elections back to January 1st. Since it was easier to keep track of the years by counting how many years a senator or potentate was in power, they moved New Year's Day to coincide with these elections. That way they could say, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, this happened. Now the Gregorian calendar moved its New Year celebration from March 21st, according to the Julian calendar, to January around 1582 CE, which sparked a new holiday, April Fool's Day. People would celebrate New Year's by visiting their neighbors on April 1st to wish them a Happy New Year. But when the Julian calendar was replaced by the Gregorian calendar in 1582, rural people were still practicing the old holiday in April, while the people in the cities had already celebrated it back in January. So there were people knocking on their neighbor's door on April 1st saying, "Happy New Year!" And their neighbors would be like, "You're about 4 months too late." A lot of mockery and pranks were then used against the rural people to tease them about their outdated practices. So as you can see, calendars are always changing. There's no obvious way to mark the beginning of the year, and it's not clear whether we should begin our days at sunrise, sunset, or midnight. Everyone has their own idea of what's right, and they get pretty set in their ways when a particular calendar has been used for 200 or 300 years, even though there's no right way to do this. One more thing I want to point out. Because the BC era takes place before Jesus' birth, the numbers before his birth count backwards. So if Julius Caesar was assassinated in 4 BCE, the year before his death was 45 BCE. This is clear evidence that the calendars were not implemented until after a major event transpired. People were not counting down to the years until Jesus' birth. No one used the Christian years before Jesus because no one knew when it would occur, let alone that it would occur. We apply those backward dates retrospectively to maintain consistency with the timeline we are currently using. This can be confusing for people, especially when referring to which century something occurred in. A century is a span of 100 years. A decade is 10 years, and a millennium is 1,000 years. So the first century started in year number 1. There was no year 0. So the first century lasted from 1 CE to 100 CE. The second century took place from 101 to 200 CE. The third century lasted from 201 to 300, etc. You would think that the term century would coincide with the number in the hundredths place, but it doesn't. The 5th century refers to the years 401 to 500. That's why we are currently living in the 21st century, not the 20th century. The Fox Corporation had to change its name from 20th Century Fox in the 1980s and 1990s to 21st Century Fox in the 2000s. The same thing applies to the BC era. The 1st century BCE refers to the years 100 BC to 1 BCE. The 2nd century BCE refers to the years 200 to 101 BCE. You got it? On an exam, I want you to know what century the year 1492 belongs to. Can you figure it out? How about the year 1521? Historians often refer to certain eras in time by the century in which it occurred. You will need to know this terminology if you're going to understand what people are talking about.